Today we have our guest, Jordan Harbinger. So, Jordan is a former Wall Street lawyer turned podcast interviewer, best known for covering a broad range of topics in communication and self help. His podcast, The Jordan Harbinger Show, has over 15 million downloads per month and is listed in Apple's top 10 in education. So, welcome to the show, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. Apologies for the head cold voice, but I have two little kids, and they make damn sure that I have a different virus every single month. So here we are.
Appreciate you still powering through it.
Sure, no problem.
All right, so where I'd like to start the conversation is around a topic that affects a ton of people, and people often don't know how to navigate this. It's not something people even talk about a lot, or they may feel like it's a secret they don't want to share. And so the topic is around changing career paths or transitioning career paths. So you started your career as a lawyer, but then you shifted over to a dating coaching business and then now your own podcast. Can you walk us through kind of how did you go about even making that decision to shift?
Sure. So some decisions were made for me and some were made consciously or deliberately, right? So when I started the podcast, I was actually still in law school, and it was a hobby. It had been a natural extension of me teaching networking skills and then trying to parlay that into the dating thing and recording. I say lectures, but I'm using the term very loosely. You know, me instructing at a bar to men and women is a totally different thing than a real lecture. But I would record those, turned that into a podcast when podcasting was new, 2006 kind of new. And that ended up being something I really enjoyed. It turned into a side hustle, joined my Wall Street law firm after graduating from law school, worked there for a year and change, 2 years, whatever it was, hit the 2008 crash, recession, whatever you want to call that. And they said, who's going to take a buyout and leave? And I was like, I'll do it, right? Because it was full salary and benefits for, I think, 9 months at that point. And I was like, you're going to just pay me to not show up anymore? And they're like, well, when you get a new job, you report it to us and then we cut off your salary and benefits. And I was like, well, sweet, because I'm definitely not going to get a new job at another law firm. I'm going to take the money and you can keep paying me and I'll take the money and funnel it into my business. And so I did that. And that was a nice, easy transition in a way. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's not entirely true, right? I got laid off, essentially, which is not easy. But I got laid off with a severance package that you can't get unless you work for, I don't know, the government. Right? I mean, who gets 9 months salary and benefits? Doesn't even make sense. So that was fantastic. And then when I ran into some other problems years later, like 10, 11 years later with my dating company business partners, where I was like, I'm sick of dating stuff. I mean, this is just played out. I don't love it. I'm getting married. This is just, it's ridiculous. It's just borderline ridiculous. And I'm not on apps and all the dating was doing this thing and I was going this other way in life, totally different direction. And so there was a disagreement there. And then I left the company and it was a rough patch because it was like, well, we're not going to give you any assets and then we're going to dick you around in your stock. And it was just a whole, they couldn't afford to do it right. So they just decided to do it wrong, which turned out to be a really big mistake on their part. There was a lot of luck involved, right? Because I left the business and started my own thing. And then that year, Me Too kicked off and anybody who was teaching dating stuff was now up against it. And I thought, well, good, I'm out of that business. And then as soon as that old company started to rebrand, the pandemic hit and it was like, business it was an events business, essentially. It just completely got nuked. Meanwhile, this rough transition for me turned out to be great because I essentially had all the time in the world to rebuild the Jordan Harbinger Show, which was my media company, the podcast business. And then 2 years later, this pandemic hits and I'm like, wow, I'm really glad that I made that transition somewhat on my own terms. It didn't work out at all, really, right? Everything went haywire, but it wasn't global catastrophe that threw me into that. So there's something to be said for having multiple irons in the fire because you don't have to have all those, I'm going to torture this metaphor. They don't have to all have to be equally hot irons, right? So when I was working on Wall Street, I was a lawyer and I had my podcasting business and some dating coaching stuff, but I wasn't making nearly as much as I was as a Wall Street finance attorney, right? Of course. But then when that crashed, I was like, well, I'm not going to be homeless. I don't have to go get a job I don't want. I'll just be kind of poor for a while. No problem. Survivable at age 27. And then when my other transition hit, I didn't have kids yet. I was married. And my wife's like, we're going to be fine. You know, we have savings. We live below our means. Your media company is building brick by brick. Maybe we need a couple years to get things off the ground. We have a lot of allies. We have a really good network. And I'll speak to that in a second. So we're going to be good. And so having different things that you can do is always good. It doesn't mean you have to be running 7 businesses or have 15 different income streams. But I do recommend people not just go all in on their cryptocurrency startup that they work for. Sometimes you don't have a choice. If you're a startup founder, you're a startup founder. But if you're working somewhere else, you need to have other opportunities, at least on the horizon, that you think might turn into something. And you need to practice turning them into a little something. The other thing I mentioned before was the network. And I think that's really the key. That's like the best insurance that money could never buy. And what I mean by that is when I had problems with my old company, one of the first things I did is made a list of, I think it was like 100 people that I wanted to call and be like, what do I do? And a lot of these people were sort of like swinging folks. I was going to say something else, but I decided not to.
I know where you're going.
Yeah. And it was like my friend Pat Flynn, for example, who runs Smart Passive Income, a big, I don't know, I hate the word influencer, but he has a lot of influence, big email list, big podcast, whatever. I called him and I was like, this bad thing happened to me. And he's like, I'm going to email your new show out to my whole list tomorrow. And I was like, this is so nice. That probably would have cost me $25,000 to have somebody like that mail that out to their list. That would be expensive if you could buy it at all. And I had a lot of friends like that were like, do you need to borrow money? I'll loan you money. And I'm like, I can't secure it with anything other than my house. And they're like, don't worry about it. I'll just cut you a check. And we're talking like people offering me 6-figure loans that they basically think like they're probably never going to call them back, you know? And I'm like, this is you see on ESPN, right? When they interview athletes, so they're like, you find out who your friends are. And they never mean like, you're so pleasantly surprised about who your friends are. They're like, oh yeah, you find out you have no friends when you're not famous. I sort of had the opposite reaction where I was like, oh man, I'm so screwed. And I called people and they were like, we're going to back you in a way that is really surprising to me. Not like, oh, I don't deserve this, but in a way where I'm like, I know this guy kind of, and he's offering me a lot of money. I know this other person kind of, and they're offering me a lot of opportunity. I met this person 5 times, or I've known them for years on and off, but we aren't super tight, and they're offering me this like big thing that they definitely just don't have to do. And that to me was that was really nice. And that's an understatement, but it really showed the power of digging the well before you're thirsty and building relationships before you need them. Because if you start to call people for the first time when you need something, they're just like, who's this again? Why are you calling me? I don't know you. You're desperate. That's not good. But if you're calling people that you have a pre-existing relationship with, they know that pre-existing relationship was not built on you needing something. Because it couldn't have been, right? The need arose later on. And so that was extremely important. And so that's kind of what I tell younger folks is like, or anyone, you really need to be digging the well before you're thirsty and building those relationships. Because when I was young, I was like, oh, networking is for old people. I don't need to do that. I'm fine. It happens automatically. It happens organically. I know people in my industry, I get that objection all the time, even from adults. They're like, oh, I'm very well connected. I'm 45 and and I'm like, what happens if you want to switch industries? Oh, I would never do that. This is a great industry. Okay, it is now. What happens when it gets regulated into oblivion or you get hit by the recession so hard that 4,500 professionals in your shoes are now out of work? That's what happened with finance. It was like, oh, you can find another legal job. And I was like, where? Bear Stearns, all these banks went out of business. So everyone there with 20 years of experience is looking for a job. I've got 18 months of experience and I'm going to go into a client firm that services one of those banks that went out of business and I'm going to find a job. You're crazy. And so I noticed that people, when their network is really siloed in one area, you can get a rude awakening. You think you're a big cheese, well connected, and then you find out that none of it matters because everybody you know is also out of a job. And it was tomorrow. And that can happen. I don't know why people think it can't. They forget. But memories are short.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like as time goes on, things just accelerate, industries change at an exponential rate. So that's definitely something, to be prepared for. I think something that you touched on that was very interesting was about having multiple irons in the fire at the same time. And so
Mhm.
just because you're thinking about switching a career or, starting that business doesn't mean you have to go all in. You can keep your corporate job or you can keep the business you have. And
Definitely.
hey, let's start working on those things and kind of see how that goes.
Dude,
Um,
that's I want to say something about that if you don't mind. So
yeah.
a lot of these online business guru type people, and I pick on Gary Vee because I've known him for like 20 years and he's a nice person. But he tells you, he'll go all in, man. And I can't do a Gary Vee imitation, but I wish I could. He's like, go all in, man, quit your job, blah, 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 sell furniture on Craigslist. I don't know. But here's the problem with that. If you go all in, for some people, that encourages motivation. But for most people, what it does is it severely limits your options. And whether it increases motivation is irrelevant if your idea is not going to work. So I see these people that are like, I'm a server at a restaurant. I want to start an online business. And people are like, go all in. And I'm like, that's a terrible, terrible idea. Because what you're doing is you're taking the economic engine that is running your life so that you don't have to have panic attacks every night. And you're cutting it out so that you are now going to starve if you don't make your online business work. But the problem is it doesn't matter how motivated you are in a business if you don't know what you're doing. Okay,
Mhm.
so which nobody does in business, especially when it's your first business. So you should never go all in. Well, let me qualify that. The point where you go all in is when you've been working on something and it's been a couple years or a few years, and the sticking point is that you don't have enough time and you are the only person who can do that, run that function in your business. So if you are handcrafting boat hulls, whatever, and you're the person who makes those, you should try to outsource every other element of your business before you quit your job at whatever bar or whatever where you're working. You should try to outsource every other part of that business, including the making of the boat hulls. Okay. But let's say you're the only person who can do that particular thing. Then you can go all in because now you have a business that's paying you more than the other one, right? Or will be when you scale and you're the bottleneck. What people do is they go, oh, I made a couple sales. I'm going to quit my job and start doing this full time. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why do you need the extra 8 hours a day? What are you going to do? And if you ask them to plan that out, then they'll be like, oh, I'm going to do content marketing, social media. And I'm like, okay, how's that going to relate to sales? And why do you have to be the one that does that? Why can't you hire a content marketer that works part-time, does that for you, scales it, tests it, see if it works, and you manage it still after work? And nobody can really answer that question. It feels good to go all in because you're like, I'm an entrepreneur. Great. But the problem is that doesn't pay the bills. And so I always say, don't quit your day job until you have to quit your day job to scale your business, or your business is making so much money that there's no point in having a day job. If you're making $3 million a year, you don't need your job as a teacher making 75 or 100. You just don't. Because now that's taking up a bunch of your time. Maybe you're burning out, whatever it is. But it doesn't ever make sense to go all in so that you just have more time for some vague, nebulous purpose. And there's a lot of bad advice out there from people saying to go and do that. I think it's just a really, really harmful thing to recommend.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think there's a big difference between experimenting with something versus once you truly gain some traction and it makes sense. And like you said, that cutting the financial engine that kind of supports things can create that added stress that probably works counter to you being successful. So the next topic I want to talk about is around the concept of starting over. So when you left your previous business and before you started the Jordan Harbinger show, I got to imagine there's some sort of lull period, right? You go from, okay, I'm familiar with how this business runs, and then now I'm doing something totally new. Can you walk us through how you navigated starting over from your old business over to the Jordan Harbinger show? And what was that period like where you're almost back in startup mode?
Yeah, so it was really scary because in the beginning you think, oh man, I was at the top of the mountain. Now I'm at the bottom of the mountain. It's going to take me like 5 years to get to where I was yesterday. How demoralizing. And what you don't realize is you're just climbing a totally different mountain, except for you're now an experienced mountain climber. So it doesn't feel like it in the moment. But then when you start building, you realize, oh, okay, this is actually not nearly as bad as I thought. And what was really good about this was I, in the beginning, was just panic mode, couldn't sleep, super, super stressed. Like the legal issues were taking its toll. I was like, how am I going to feed my family? Whatever. Once I started to focus and made a plan on what I was going to do, and I realized I could only put one foot in front of the other, go one step at a time, that's when I really started to appreciate the idea of focused energy. So before I was like a blender with no lid, where it was like I had all this energy, but it was like the stuff was just spewing out the top, right? I wasn't getting anywhere and I was just spinning my wheels and it felt terrible. And then when I started to make a plan, I was like, look, it's either going to take me 5 years or 10 years or whatever, but either way, I'm getting there one step at a time. So I made a huge plan. It was like, call these people, do these podcasts, record these guests, get the show feed up and running, get a website up and running, get the show art going, whatever it was. Like I had things I had to do every day. And I started to do those. And even though the progress was always, of course, slower than you want in the moment, I didn't feel like I wasn't doing anything because every day I took a couple of steps forward. And so that was scary, but then it turned out to be just as long as I had forward momentum, I felt okay about it. And then before I knew it, like 8 months in, I was already more profitable than my old company at the peak earning of that company. I was already more profitable after like 8 or 10 months in my new business. And part of it was, you think, oh, I've got to get to the level of revenue where my old company was. No, I had to get to the level of profit where I could survive. And that came within a few months because I didn't have dead weight business partners who weren't adding much value to the bottom line. I didn't have an office space that I had to pay for. I didn't have crazy expense accounts where people were going nuts that I couldn't, I didn't have any of that stuff. And so I was like, oh, the profit margin was like 90% instead of like 10. And so we were able to get a lot further, a lot faster because we had that forward momentum, and it wasn't nearly as tough as I thought it was going to be. But a lot of that had to do with the focus. And so I recommend anybody who feels like, oh my God, I just got laid off or fired or my business collapsed. First of all, make sure that your network is in order. And one way to do that is to make a list of right now, before things fall apart, hopefully, make a list of 10, 15 people who you would call, like you would in theory call if your business imploded or you got laid off, and then reach out to those people now before your business implodes and before you're laid off and rekindle that relationship, see what they're up to, tell them what you're up to. And then in 6 months, a year, 2 years, if something does happen to you, you're reaching out to those people and you're not going, hey, haven't talked since high school. And they're like, is this going to be like a Scientology thing or what? You're just talking to somebody that and you're saying, hey, do you have any job leads that like my company laying people off? It's not the first time they've heard from you in 10 years, 5 years, right? You're just talking to somebody you spoke with a few months back. So make sure your network is in order. And if things are already hitting the fan, make a plan of what you need to do. Because I found I slept a lot easier if I did 10 things I needed to do, even if I was a million miles away from my goal, versus, oh my God, I have a million things to do. And I'm just picking random ones out and spinning around in circles with my, like a chicken with my head cut off every single day. And then going to bed and going, how did I not do anything today? This is my whole life now. I'm screwed. That anxiety tends to calm when you are laser focused. And it was
I think you touched on a few things that are interesting there. I think one is zooming out and having a longer term view, right? When you said, hey, I'm in this, whether it takes me 5 years, 10 years. And I think zooming out oftentimes calms a lot of that anxiety when you have the patience and knowing, hey, I'm on day 100 of a 1,000-day journey. And so I think that's a very important point there. Now let's switch over to talking about podcasting. You're obviously, a legend in the podcasting space. You've been in the space for 15 plus years. So I think the first place I want to start out is around podcast intros, because I think podcast intros are essentially the elevator pitch for what your podcast is about. And I think you have a very interesting one where you kind of tweak it with each episode as well, where you'll insert different people that you have conversations with. So I'd like to read it just for the audience so they get an idea of what your show is about. So your podcast intro says, on the Jordan Harbinger Show, we decode the stories, secrets, and skills of the world's most fascinating people. We have in-depth conversations with scientists, entrepreneurs, spies, and psychologists, even the occasional mafia enforcer, former cult member, rocket scientist, or hostage negotiator. And each episode turns our guest wisdom into practical advice that you can use to build a deeper understanding of how the world works and become a better thinker. So my question to you is, how did you come up with the show intro, and how should somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast think through that process?
So I came up with the show intro, and the way you do this is you think, who's listening for the first time? Somebody. What do I need to tell that person? Because what if the episode they listen to is me talking with Billy McFarland from Fire Festival, who like famously screwed everyone over and went to prison? Do I want people to think, oh, this is a show where he interviews like fraudsters or something? Oh, that's weird. That maybe they don't like that. What I want is for people to listen and go, wow, there's a lot of stuff on this show. I tuned in for the episode that somebody emailed me about the Firefest guy, but it sounds like he's got, what was that? Mafia enforcers and rocket scientists and hostage negotiators. I mean, there's a lot of interesting people on this show. And it's not just I interview people randomly out of nowhere. It's, oh yeah, this guy, he interviews people and gets really good stories, but there's also practical advice. And so there's stuff I'm learning. You're sort of programming your audience to take those things away from it. And I noticed that podcasts that just have interviews, and the audience often doesn't really know what they're getting, right? It's just kind of like, oh, I listened to this conversation. Well, what'd you learn? I don't know, nothing. I mean, it was just funny. Okay, so is there value there? It's entertainment. Well, maybe I don't want to do that. So you tell the audience what they're going to get, and then they look for it. And then since they're looking for it, they're more likely to find it, right? This is sort of a confirmation bias thing. You're taking advantage of that. So I want to say you're going to learn things that you can use in your life. And we have this wide variety of guests. And here's the one that you're listening to now. And that's a good show intro. So if you're doing this for your own show, think about what you want. Think of the through line through all of your whatever interviews or whatever they are, and tell people what that through line is so that they don't have to guess, right? If you're interviewing only criminals, you might say, this is a show where we interview some of the most notorious people known to man, and we learn the how they did what they did so we can avoid becoming a victim, or so we can get an inside look at the underworld, in a world we seldom see. Cool. Now I know I'm getting an inside look at something that most people don't get. So I feel like I have inside information, which is a good feeling, right? So that's why I listen to your show. You want somebody to be able to hear that, turn around, and tell somebody else through a game of telephone why they like your show. Well, I listen to Jordan because, man, he's got such a wide variety of people on there. There's like mafia guys and there's criminals on there, but there's also like scientists, rocket scientists, and you just learn, you hear their stories and you learn your practical advice. And the other person goes, that's really cool. But if you just say, here's a bunch of interviews, then they have to make up they have to craft the intro when they share it. And it's like, yeah, this guy, oh, it's just so interesting. What's interesting about it? Oh, I mean, you just have to listen to it. And they're going to go, nah, there's a million podcasts. I'm not just going to, thanks for the recommendation, kind of, but nah, I'm going to just forget about this immediately, basically.
In addition to that, when it comes to the title of a podcast, I think that could be equally important in terms of describing or making it clear what it's about. And obviously your podcast is after your name, but someone thinking about starting a podcast, how would you advise them to kind of think through that? Would you have it be more direct, like the mountain biking show, or go with their name and build long term? How should someone think about that?
Yeah, I don't think you should go with your name. And people, it's funny because I had a guy that I know was like, oh, it's all ego. And I'm like, no, it's just a really sort of lack of insight that you got to be kind of careful with this. If you are not an established player in the space, don't name your show the Michael Smith Show because nobody cares. The reason my show is called the Jordan Harbinger Show is the chief search for anything having to do with my old company for months and months and months after I left was, where is Jordan Harbinger? Because I just left this really big podcast. And I almost named my show, Where is Jordan Harbinger, thinking I'll change it later. And then I realized, okay, actually through Google search tools, if I just name it The Jordan Harbinger Show, I get like 97% of that search traffic still pointing to me, because people would say like Jordan Harbinger podcast, Jordan Harbinger show. Those are the two top queries, along with like, where is Jordan Harbinger and stuff like that. So I thought, okay, great. I'm going to name my show that. And then when people search for that, there will be one result, and that will be me. But other friends of mine who are really good at branding, they're like, no, name it like the Live Your Best Life Show, or what I'm making, I'm pulling things out of the air. But that doesn't say anything to somebody who's looking for me specifically. Also,
And it was
What if I want to do something else later? A friend of mine named his show, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't want to throw him under the bus, but he named it something like Networking Podcast. And it was more clever than that. But I said, dude, don't do that, because if you do, now your show has to be about networking pretty much forever. And he's like, yeah, but I feel like it's flexible enough and it really is about networking. And I'm like, all right. And 2 years later, he's like, dude, I remember you telling me not to do this. And I really don't want to talk about networking anymore. I want to talk about startups and business and other things like that. And I'm like, yeah. So he's like, I'm just going to name it this other thing. And I'm like, don't keep changing the name to match the niche you're in, unless you have a very narrow niche. If you're talking about cryptocurrency, name it something with cryptocurrency, fine. What you should not be doing is naming it something random that doesn't say anything about your show. And your name is always going to fall into that category. The only reason my show is called the Jordan Harbinger Show is there's a lot of search queries on Google and in podcast apps for my name. And what I didn't want was them to find other shows that where I was a guest or that I'd been running for years and left. I wanted my show to come up first. So it was very functional. And I think you should do the same. You know, there's something to be said for clever names, but it's much better to write something like the Dating Advice Podcast versus Dating Your Way with Charla. It's like, well, one's clever, but nobody's searching Dating Your Way with Charla. People are searching Dating Advice Podcast, and if yours comes up first, they'll probably check it out. So you don't want people to have to look for you specifically, because they're just never going to do that, except in very rare circumstances where they are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your podcast workflow. So you're producing quite a bit of volume, and it's all high production stuff. You're not, in your garage recording on, your iPhone. And so I'm wondering, what does it really look like? Like, peel back the curtain for our audience of what does it look like to put on a show like that and at that volume?
Yeah, so volume is great, except in markets like this where there's not enough ads to fill at every show. So I give my team a little bit of time off lately. So what I've been doing primarily is I do 2 interviews a week, and I do a Friday advice show because people write in and ask us for advice. And then on Sunday, I do Skeptical Sunday, where I debunk a topic like recycling or chemtrails or why the Olympics are kind of a sham, stuff like that. And so it's almost like 3 different shows. So the Friday advice episodes, my co-host producer, Gabriel Mizrahi, we've got a separate email inbox. People write there. Thousands of people write in there. He goes through all those questions, picks ones he wants. We craft the answers. We rehearse. Then we do the recording. Skeptical Sunday, I hire these scientists and or fact checker type journalist folks. They go in, they do a ton of research about a topic. Then they craft a script and we go in and we record the script. The interviews, I read the whole book. Usually, if there's a book, which takes a long time, and I take notes, and then I interview the guest based on those notes. So it's a lot of work. Like, you're talking about, maybe it's not me doing the prep for Friday and Sunday, but I'm doing the prep for the Tuesday, Thursday, and that's at least 10, 15 hours of work to prep those. So that's a ton of work. And of course, I'm also answering fan mail. I'm exploring business opportunities. I'm screening guests for the show to see if they're interesting by doing phone calls, researching, watching them give a talk on YouTube, see if they're interesting on other podcasts, whatever it is. So there's a lot of that kind of work. And then once I record it, the video gets uploaded from Squadcast over to our Google Drive, where our video editor gets a hold of it. He takes care of that and sends it to the YouTube team, which creates the videos and the shorts, and then uploads it, tags it, whatever, on the YouTube channel. But our audience is primarily audio. And so our show engineer, who's like a sound engineer, he spends 8 to 9 hours editing the actual audio show. That's why people will say something like, wow, this is really well produced, or wow, Ray Dalio, there's a guest, Ray Dalio, is a well-known finance guy. And on the YouTube, I don't know if he was nervous, tired, whatever, but he said a lot. And in the audio version, we just cut all of those out, and there were hundreds. Wow. And so people who listen to the audio, it's funny because there'll be people who know Ray Dalio or work with him, and they're like, wow, he was really focused with you. And then it's like, they'll watch the YouTube and they're like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't get the same vibe. And it's like, yeah, we edited this whole thing to the point where there was no filler words, no tangents, nothing. But you can't do that on a video, because imagine cutting out something every minute in the video. Weird. It would it would just look weird. So it would look like a YouTube short that's an hour long. It doesn't make any sense, or a TikTok video. So it's really nice to do that kind of editing in audio. And you can add music and you can do funny things with the ad reads. Like, it's a whole different game. And so that is our workflow. And then after the audio engineer is done with that, he sends it to the show notes guy who listens to it, crafts the show notes, and then uploads the files to the content management system, which is how it ends up on servers that end up on people's phones as a podcast. But I'm hands off after recording. Like, I'm done. I'm on to the next thing minutes later, after lunch anyway.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. So I believe to be really great at anything, you need three things. You need practice, actually being in the game, working on your craft. Number two is learning new skills, enhancing your existing skills. And number three is around mentors. And so obviously you're getting a lot of practice through actually producing shows, but I'm curious, when it comes to skills, especially after being in this for 15 years, how do you keep working on your skills and what do you focus on now?
Well, it's a good question, and I agree with that. I know a lot of people who are at a whatever level, and they're like, it's funny. If you talk to a writer who's really, really good, like Mark Manson or James Clear or something like that, they're always working on something. And I've got coaching for podcasting and speaking and vocal tonality and voice acting and whatever else. And when I meet people that are kind of like yellow belt, they're like, oh, I don't need a coach. I'm good. I've got practice. And it's like, man, you're really kind of not getting it. When you're a white belt, and you're not really a belt in anything like this, but I'm going to use that analogy anyways. When you're a white belt, you're like, I don't know squat. I better get somebody who knows what they're doing. And then you get that yellow belt or that green belt, and you're like, I'm good. I know what I'm doing. All I have to do now is practice. But the problem is you don't know what to practice. You don't see the holes in your own game. Maybe you think you do, but you really don't, because how could you? And then you work around for a long time. You spin around for a long time, but you're not really focused on working on anything because you can't even spot your own blind spots. And it takes you a lot longer to get better. And I've seen this before. So Howard Stern, who is a world famous interviewer, world famous radio host, whatever. And he is by all means the most popular radio host in the world. I mean, by all accounts, right? To whatever, $500 million deal with Sirius XM radio, all this stuff. He prepares every interview. He looks at other stuff that person has done. He watches their latest movies. He reads the book. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why is he doing that? Because he knows that the preparation is not optional. He knows that part is not optional. And so if Howard Stern is going to do it, maybe we should all be doing it. Maybe he knows something that we don't. I found that beginners, they prep because they have to. Amateurs don't prep because they think they don't have to. And then professionals prep because they know that they have to. And they went through the amateur phase where they thought they could wing it and it didn't fucking work.
I love that separation between those three different levels. That makes a lot of sense and very true. And so let's talk about growing and marketing a podcast. So obviously over 15 years, you've seen a lot of different ways to grow a podcast. And I'm curious, when looking at the landscape today, what are some of the best ways for someone launching a podcast to actually grow their podcast?
Growing a podcast is really tough, man. I mean, look, it's always about consistently good quality over a longer period of time, because word of mouth is how podcasts get shared. There's a lot of hubbub about like, oh, you need TikTok clips and you need this and that. And it's, no one has been able to show me any data that TikTok or YouTube converts to podcast listeners. There's a certain amount of it. Look, if you have 15 million subscribers on YouTube and you start a podcast, you're probably going to do okay with your audio podcast. If you don't, and you've got a podcast with 10,000 listeners, starting to go into making TikTok and Instagram and a YouTube and a whatever, they're not necessarily going to feed back into your podcast. I'm not going to say they're a waste of time, but what I am saying is now you're feeding other content machines. You're building a separate audience that's not necessarily going to be monetizable by feeding back into your podcast. And this is important because what happens is you get sold a bill of goods by these guys who are going to edit clips for you or whatever and for social. And you're like, oh man, look, I'm posting these clips, I'm getting followers, I'm getting a little bit of engagement. It doesn't really matter because you're not getting more podcast listeners. You're just building your whatever nebulous brand awareness on another platform. Fine, if you want to be famous on social media, okay, but it's not doing anything for your business really. At least not at the where the rubber meets the road kind of level. It's not going to be something where you're monetizing. Look, if you somehow end up with millions of views per day on TikTok, the conversion might happen where people start to look for your podcast. That might be a thing. But most of us can't rely on that kind of algorithm to just take over and help us grow like wildfire. It's just highly unlikely. So what's most likely to happen is you're going to grow your show slowly by doing something really good that gets people sharing it, and you're going to end up with a snowball effect because you're retaining people. So I think growing a podcast is great. If you're doing it for money, it's really hard. If you're doing it because you enjoy it, it's really good. YouTube is a great way to grow a YouTube-based podcast, but don't expect YouTube listener or viewers to come suddenly listen to your audio. It's very, very rare, almost never happens, and conversion is extremely, extremely low. So you're really building it in two areas. And YouTube I mentioned specifically because you can, if you're monetizing your audio podcast via ads like I do, if you've got enough critical mass on YouTube, you can read those ads in a YouTube video and you can get maybe not the same CPM as audio, but you can get a better CPM than Google AdSense will give you. And that's great. So if you get 1 million subscribers on YouTube, or let's say you're getting 50,000 views in a video, you can almost add that to your audio podcast impressions. It's going to be monetized differently. You're still building two different outlets, but you do have to be pretty careful about trying to do everything at once, thinking it's all going to somehow point back to your show, because it's just not. It's just not. You're making a media company of different outlets. So I ignore TikTok. I don't post much on Instagram. I don't tweet really. I engage with fans on those platforms because people are there and they want to DM me or whatever, and I'll share the episodes there, but I'm not trying to be clever, make viral videos, whatever it is. I'm not doing any of that. It's just another inbox for me. My primary platform is the audio podcast and a little bit of YouTube. And I plan on just keeping it that way because I don't want to hire 12 people to run a media company. You know, this is a lifestyle business. I've got kids. I want to spend time with them. I want to grow, sure, but I'm not going to do that by killing myself making stupid dance videos. I know a lot of guys that run podcasts that are following TikTok trends, and it's very cringe, and they're miserable because they think, oh, I just got to hit that algorithm and then people are going to find me. And it's just not true. It's just not real.
Yeah, that sounds exhausting as well. Always trying to chase what the next trend is. And something you touched on that I thought was very important was around the idea of focus and not trying to be everywhere, not trying to be on every platform. And I think it goes back to just asking yourself, what's the objective? For you, it's thinking about creating the audio format. You want to build your following with your podcast. So you put all your energy and focus in there. And I think that's a very, very important point. So now let's shift over to talking about you operating as a solopreneur. Essentially, I'm curious, what does your team look like? That's something I'm very interested in lately. It's the idea of people that work with a very small team, but in a very high leverage way. And so I'm curious, what does your team look like today?
So my team is me, my wife, my audio engineer, my show notes guy, my video editor, and we have a transcriptionist. And there's and my co-host producer on my Friday shows. And then I've got contractors that do maybe like 1 episode a month of a Skeptical Sunday episode. They don't do anything else on the team. They're not responsible for anything else. They don't, work on our Slack or any company Slack or anything like that. So what's great about that is I can pick a whole great roster full of people and get different sort of voices in there. But my regular team is small, and I've had the same people working here since the inception of the company. This is a new show, so since early 2018. But even before that, everybody who works with me now, almost everybody, worked with me at my previous company, and when I left, they also left because they didn't want to work with my previous business partners because they saw the writing on the wall. And so it was, I kept the show notes guy, I kept my producer, I kept my associate producer, I kept my wife, obviously came with me, I kept my audio engineer who's been with us for 10 plus years. So it's actually been quite interesting and fun to work with those same people for a really long time. What's great about that is I don't find myself managing that much. Everybody knows what they have to do. Everybody gets their stuff done on time. If there's a problem, people say something on the Slack and something else happens. It's fine. I don't I've seen bigger companies where people have like 42 employees, and it's chaos, and there's always a fire to put out, and there's drama and blah blah. We don't have any of that, nothing like that.
Yeah,
And it was
that's the beautiful thing about working with people for so long. I have people on my team as well that I've been with for 10 years and many 5, 6 years. And I have the same feeling. People kind of get it, right? They understand how to work with you, how to work with each other over time. And there's just that nice compounding effect. Their skills get better. It's something I think really important to consider there. And so next is around you're clearly a high performer. You've achieved a lot. And I'm curious, like now, what does the typical week look like for you?
Well, I am quite busy, but having kids does that. It's funny when my kids are like with the grandparents or something like that, I go, wow, what am I going to do with all this time? I have like 5 extra hours every day. So I get up in the morning. I've got a trainer usually. I check the email and all that stuff. I'd make sure everybody has what they need for the day to get something done. I want to make sure that someone's not like, I need this thing because I'm stuck. So I check that. I check for anything urgent. I might read a little bit of news, whatever it is. I do a workout and or a Mandarin Chinese lesson. So I get the body and brain going, or at least the brain going in the morning. Then take a shower, of course, eat a little breakfast. And then around 9:30, 10 a.m., I'm working on email, fan mail, doing a phone call. 10:30 rolls around. Sometimes there's a recording session till noon. Then I've got lunch, whether it's long or short. Sometimes it's long. Most of the days it's like an hour and a half, 2 hours. So I go out to lunch with my wife, whatever. And then in the afternoon, usually there's either more recording or I've got some tasks to do, like reading, show prep, stuff like that. And then I go pick up my kids from school. So my work days are actually pretty short. I'm looking, if I look, whoops, I almost deleted something off my calendar. If I look at this day, let's see, Monday, I work from 10 to 5 with a 2-hour lunch. So, I mean, I'm putting in 5-6 hours a day of work. It's not much more than that. And I could work more and get more done, but it's a choice, right? Because once you start to have kids, you realize, oh, every extra hour that I'm spending building my social media presence or whatever, or like chasing celebrity guests, it's different when you're single because you're like, what am I going to do? Watch Netflix, go drinking, whatever. But when you have kids, you're like, I'm trading an hour with my young son so that I can like DM spam some the trade-off becomes so obviously not worth it. And so I made a promise to myself and to my wife and kids early on that I was just not going to work till 7 p.m. every day and miss tons of their life so we could make a little bit of extra money that we don't need, right? It didn't make any sense. And you start to realize like, oh, I'm building this business and it's great. It's for money/ego, but now what? I'm trading my relationship with my family. It's not a good trade.
Exactly. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about what's the objective? What are you optimizing for there? And what you said there too about it being a choice, it reminds me of I was in Prague and on a tour, and it was just a 3-hour tour around the city. And I asked the guy, hey, how many tours do you do a day? And he's like, I only do one. And I was like, well, it's only 3 hours. Like, why don't you do 2 a day and make twice as much money? And his answer was, I don't want to lose the enthusiasm I show up with every tour. And I thought that was very interesting of how intentional he was to know that, I need rest and to recharge to be able to perform at my best for his guests. And I think what you said there too, by kind of keeping that tight schedule and optimizing for the things you care most about, in this case, spending time with your wife and kids, I think that's very powerful and, not something to be overlooked. What are some things you do to recharge your batteries?
So I do work out regularly. I fix and build radio controlled cars, which started off as a thing I was doing with my son. And now I'm just like, I just really like it myself. My kid just wants to crash them. Yeah. I used to travel a bunch until I had kids. Now it's really tough because I have 2 small children. That's pretty much it, man. There's not a whole lot of extra time when you're wiping and diping in the evening, I used to love traveling. I still do. I just do less of it. And I like reading. So I'm reading usually for the show. And I do that outside. I'm walking around, I'm reading my audiobook, listening to my audiobook, whatever. And I enjoy that. And so luckily I'm in a position where recharging my batteries looks a lot like work, but it doesn't feel like work. And that's always really nice. That's always really, really nice.
And let's talk about choosing opportunities and choosing what to say yes or no to. So
Sure.
as you get more successful, you're obviously getting a lot of different opportunities and you have limited time, especially when you have your certain priorities. How do you go about choosing what to say yes or no to?
Sure. It's tough. I mean, if it's a speaking gig, if it's a speaking gig or an event, I have these three pillars, and it's either payment, people, or place. So if the gig is in Greece and it's at a 5-star resort and they're not going to pay me, but there's going to be good people there and it's at this exotic place, I'll probably go do that. If it is in the middle of nowhere and it's going to be 0 degrees outside, but they're giving me 30 grand, I'll be there. You know what I mean? Because the pay is fine. So it has to fulfill one or ideally two of those pillars. But if one pillar is really tall, then it's fine, right? If somebody wants to bring me somewhere and it's not necessarily going to be an interesting place and I'm not making any money, but it's going to be a great crowd, like a really good crowd, I'll go there and do that because it's worthwhile. If the money's really high, I'll go do that because it's worthwhile. If the place is going to be absolutely epic and it's something you can never do on your own, then I'll go there because it's going to be worthwhile. But ideally, you get two, right? Like it's in an interesting place and they're going to pay you, but it's a bunch of insurance brokers. So there's probably not going to be necessarily anything there for you. You never know, of course, but they'll still do that kind of thing. So I try to evaluate that, events and speaking gigs in that way. Other stuff though, like my agent's like, write a book. We're going to get you in advance. It's going to be blah, blah, blah. And everyone's like, you're crazy for not doing that. That's so much, you got this and it would be great. And you're at that level where you just hire a ghostwriter. And I'm like, but the problem is you write a book, you spend half the advance on marketing, and then you spend the next 5 years promoting the book. So is that what I want to be doing? It's not the time writing the book. And then there's pressure. It's like, oh, well, we gave you $2 million. So you better sell like 200,000 copies of this book. What happens when I sell 25,000? They're like, oh my God, this is not good. You're making us look bad. Now I've got this pressure. I feel guilty. I don't want to do that to myself. And I can write a book in 10 years when my kids they don't want to hang out with dad anymore because I'm lame, that I'll do it then. Those opportunities will always be there. I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So for me, I just try to pick, and I'd say no to pretty much everything if it's going to take more time and energy, unless my friend Mark Manson has a good way of talking about it. And Derek Sivers, I think, is where he got this from. But it's like hell yes or hell no. And so if somebody says, do you want to do this project? If it's like, well, I don't know, then the answer is no. But if it's, do you want to do this project? And it's like, hell yeah, that would be really cool. I bet that would work out. It would be fun. Let's give it a shot. Then I'll do it. So I do hell yes, hell no. But also for things that have to do with the business, it's a little bit more measured and calculated, depending, because there's hell yes might be because they're going to pay you so much money that you'd be a fool to say no. But the book thing is like that. And I'm still saying no because I know what I'm trading, which is literally hours and hours and hours every month of my life that I would be spending with my kids.
Yeah, I think by having the combination of certain filters of how you think about that, and at the same time knowing exactly what you want, helps to make that decision easier. And so the last question I want to wrap up with here, I feel like this podcast wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about networking, communication. Sure. So a lot of our audience are working professionals, business owners. What are some practical tips or advice around communication or certain resources you may point them towards?
Sure. So earlier in the show, I gave that drill where you write down 10 or 15 people who you would call if you got laid off or your business went bankrupt tomorrow. Do that. Make that list. Call those people now while you don't need anything, because that'll shake off the rust. And it will get you realizing that a lot of people really are excited to hear from you, even though you didn't think they would even remember who you are. Another thing I recommend for especially professionals, you don't have to be in sales. Go into your phone, go into your text messaging app, go all the way to the bottom. That's where those dead threads are. It's like somebody you had lunch with who's a friend of another friend. You haven't seen either of them in 3 years. Send those people an update text about what you're doing and ask what they're doing. Not can they do something for you, not do they want to jump on the phone, just tell them what you're up to. Say you did a crappy job of keeping in touch and you're trying to change that here in 2023, and ask what they're up to. you will be very surprised how many people are like, wow, I haven't heard from you. Cool. Oh man, I'm following your business on Instagram or whatever, and I'm doing this, and I had a kid, and here's a picture of the kid. You're going to be very surprised. If you do that with 1 or 2 people per day, you're going to get through a lot of folks in a month and in 2 months, and you're going to find opportunities that come from that, both personal and in business. You're going to rekindle relationships. And what you're going to find also is that keeping in touch with people is not only important, but it's relatively easy and doesn't require you to like go network at a mixer where you got to buy a parking ticket and show up and everyone's like bouncing a ball around and introducing themselves. That's not real networking. That's not real relationship development. That's like some learning annex crap. You don't need to do that. The real high performers are constantly keeping in touch with people by light touches here and there on a semi-regular basis that's very unobtrusive and doesn't take a lot of time, like 5 minutes, 6 minutes a day. I've got a free course on it. There's no upsells. I don't want your credit card number. If I can plug it, cool. It's called 6 Minute Networking and has those 2 drills and 10 more or 11 more. And again, the course is free. And it's the stuff I teach to military, corporate, education institutions. And I made the course free because I think we're all better for having better relationship development skills. And the fact that I teach this to young people, like kids and college kids and professionals, and they just take it and run and they get raises and better jobs, that's worth it to me. Plus, those people kind of become an extension of my own network in a way. So there's nice ROI in terms of the social capital that I might get from that. So I highly encourage people to check that out. It's at jordanharbinger.com/course. And again, you don't have to like put your card in there. It's not a tricky thing. And
awesome. Thank you for those tips, Jordan. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this show. In addition to the course, is there anything else? Where can viewers find you?
Yeah, sure. Look, if you're interested in what I had to say and you like this kind of thing, the Jordan Harbinger Show has great interviews, good advice. I think people might enjoy the Jordan Harbinger Show. It's a podcast. We do have some stuff on YouTube, but mostly it's an audio podcast. So I would love to hear from people who find us through this and come become fans of the show.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jordan. Appreciate you coming on the show. Really enjoyed our conversation, and I think our audience is going to get a ton of value from it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.